a 25% rise. That's the number the Royal Navy has put on the increase in Russian naval and maritime activity around the United Kingdom and across the wider North Atlantic. Not an estimate from an outside think tank, not a leaked assessment. A figure attributed to the service that actually does the watching. According to USNI News, the Royal Navy logged that jump in Russian vessels and movements tracked in and around British and North Atlantic waters. The obvious question, and the one this video is going to work through, is simple. What exactly is being counted in that 25%, and what does a number like that tell us about where Russia's Navy is putting its effort right now? Here's what we're not going to do. We're not handing you a dramatized reconstruction of Russian submarines lurking in the dark, because nobody has published that. We're sticking to what's actually on the record, the reported statistic, the official statements behind it, and the established facts about how the Royal Navy and its NATO partners watch this stretch of ocean in the first place. By the end, you'll know what kind of Russian activity is being tracked, how that tracking works, and why a rise in these numbers matters specifically for NATO's northern flank. Start with what the report actually says, because attribution matters here. USNI News. The U.S. Naval Institute's news service, a publication defense reporters and navies themselves treat as a serious record of maritime activity, reported the Royal Navy's finding of a 25% increase in Russian naval and maritime activity in waters around the UK and the North Atlantic. That's the confirmed part. An official figure, from the service responsible for monitoring it, reported through a credible defense outlet. What isn't spelled out in that top-line number is the full breakdown. Which vessel types make up the increase? Over what baseline period is the 25% measured? Those details, when a Navy puts out a statistic like this, often surface later through follow-up statements, parliamentary questions, or briefings in the weeks after. We're not going to guess at numbers that haven't been published. What we can do is explain, from the public record, what Russian naval and maritime activity near the UK has actually looked like in recent years, because that gives the 25% some real context instead of leaving it floating as an abstraction. Start with the categories the Royal Navy and NATO allies have said they track in this part of the world. Surface warships transiting to and from the Mediterranean or the Arctic, submarines moving between Russia's northern bases and the open Atlantic, and a category that gets far less attention than warships but has become central to this conversation: auxiliary and intelligence-gathering vessels, ships not armed for combat but equipped to monitor, and in some cases physically inspect, the undersea cables and pipelines that Britain and its allies depend on. That last category is worth slowing down on, because it's genuinely changed how this story gets covered. For decades, the standing worry about Russian activity near Britain was fairly conventional. Submarines probing NATO's anti-submarine defenses, surface ships shadowing exercises, the Cold War playbook updated for the present. What's shifted, publicly and repeatedly over the past several years, is a specific concern about the undersea cables and pipelines carrying internet traffic, financial transactions, and electricity between the UK, Europe, and beyond. The UK. Ministry of Defense and NATO officials have said on the record, more than once, that they track Russian vessels, including ships publicly associated with Russia's Deep Sea Research and Intelligence Directorate, operating near this infrastructure. One vessel, the Yantar, has been named specifically by UK defense officials, including the Defense Secretary, as a ship the Royal Navy has monitored and at times shadowed near British waters. That's not part of the 25% figure itself. The sourced report doesn't say so, but it's the kind of activity that gives Russian maritime activity near Britain its teeth in the public imagination. It's on the record, not speculation. To understand how the Royal Navy would even produce a number like 25%, it helps to understand the geography behind it. The stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom is known in naval circles as the GIUK Gap. 3 letters for exactly that line of geography. During the Cold War, it was the choke point NATO built an entire anti-submarine strategy around, because any Soviet submarine heading from its northern bases into the open Atlantic, where it could threaten shipping lanes or reach the U.S. coast, had to pass through or near that gap. That geography didn't disappear when the Cold War ended. Russia's northern fleet is still based on the Kola Peninsula, north of the Arctic Circle, and any of its submarines or surface ships heading south still have to pass the top of Scotland, through waters the UK and its NATO allies watch closely. When people talk about NATO's northern flank, this is largely what they mean. the alliance's most direct maritime frontier with Russian naval power, separate from the Baltic or Black Sea theaters that dominate a lot of other coverage. So what does a reported rise actually signal, according to the people whose job it is to assess it? Here's where we need to separate the confirmed fact from the interpretation stacked on top of it. The confirmed fact is the statistic itself and the Royal Navy's act of logging and reporting more tracked activity. The interpretation, that this reflects a deliberate Russian push to test NATO's northern defenses or probe response times or signal displeasure over Western support for Ukraine, comes from defense analysts and, sometimes, from officials speaking more broadly than the narrow statistic allows. Analysts generally read increased submarine and surface activity near the GIUK Gap and around British waters as serving several purposes for Russia at once: keeping a fleet that needs to exercise and resupply operationally ready, projecting presence to remind NATO the Northern Fleet is still active, and, where intelligence-gathering vessels are involved, collecting information on the routes and vulnerabilities of Western undersea infrastructure. None of that is a Royal Navy statement about this specific 25% figure. It's the broader analytical context defense specialists bring to numbers like it, and I'm labeling it as such rather than passing it off as an official explanation. I spent time going through how the UK has actually responded to this pattern of monitoring over the past few years, and one thing stands out. The investment hasn't been symbolic. In 2023, the Royal Navy brought into service a ship built specifically for this mission, RFA Proteus, a surveillance vessel whose stated role is protecting the seabed infrastructure around the UK by watching for exactly the activity described above. That's a purpose-built response to a threat category that barely featured in public defense planning a decade ago. Alongside it, the UK operates P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft out of RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland, tasked with submarine hunting over the North Atlantic and the GUK Gap. Frigates and offshore patrol vessels get sent to shadow specific Russian ships transiting near UK waters when the Ministry of Defense decides it's necessary, and NATO's Allied Maritime Command, headquartered at Northwood outside London, coordinates tracking and response across the alliance rather than leaving it to any single member navy. None of this monitoring is easy, and that's worth admitting too. The North Atlantic is enormous. Persistent surveillance over that much open ocean, around the clock, would strain any single navy's resources, which is exactly why the UK leans on NATO's Allied Maritime Command to share the load with Allied navies and aircraft instead of trying to cover the GIUK Gap alone. Even with RFA Proteus in service and P-8A Poseidon aircraft flying regular patrols out of Lossiemouth, gaps in coverage are just a structural reality of watching an ocean this size, not a failure specific to this report. When officials talk about tracked activity, that tracking depends on a limited number of ships, aircraft, and sensors being in the right stretch of water at the right time, which is one reason a rising number can reflect more Russian activity, better coverage, or some mix of both. What's most surprising, honestly, isn't that Russia is active in these waters. A northern fleet based a few hundred miles from NATO territory was always going to generate maritime traffic through this region. What's more notable is how much the public conversation, and apparently the reported statistics, have shifted from simply counting warships to counting a broader category of activity, one that increasingly includes those auxiliary and intelligence vessels near cables and pipelines. That's a different kind of number than a simple submarine count, and it's worth keeping in mind when a headline figure like 25% circulates without its full breakdown attached. Here's a take that might sit uncomfortably either way. The UK's response to this pattern: a dedicated seabed monitoring ship, more patrol aircraft flying hours, publicly naming vessels like the Yontar. Looks less like overreaction and more like a government that underfunded a real gap in maritime domain awareness for years and is now catching up under pressure. Whether that catching up is happening fast enough, given how central undersea cables are to everyday life in Britain, is a fair thing to argue about, and reasonable people land in different places on it. So here's a genuine question worth sitting with. If a 25% rise in tracked activity is what the Royal Navy is prepared to say publicly, what would it take for the picture to actually look different? Russian vessels behaving differently, or the UK, and NATO simply getting better at counting what was already out there? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's the actual interpretive problem sitting underneath a single headline statistic, and it's one the public record, as it stands right now, doesn't fully resolve. It's also worth pausing on what a rise like this doesn't automatically mean, because attribution discipline cuts both ways. On its own, it doesn't confirm a change in Russian strategic intent. Intent is something officials and analysts infer, not something a tracking number proves. The reporting available doesn't specify whether the increase is concentrated in one category of vessel or spread across warships, submarines, and auxiliary ships. And it doesn't tell us whether the Royal Navy's own tracking capability has expanded over the same period, which would inflate the reported number without any change in Russian behavior at all. Any of those explanations is plausible. None is confirmed by the sourced report alone, and a careful accounting of this story has to sit with that uncertainty rather than resolve it for the sake of a cleaner narrative. What we can say with confidence: the Royal Navy has publicly reported the 25% figure through a credible defense news outlet, and that figure sits on top of a well-documented, years-long pattern of UK and NATO investment in watching this stretch of ocean. The GI-UK gap, the waters around Britain, and the seabed infrastructure running through them. The Northern Fleet's geography hasn't changed. Russia's need to move ships and submarines through waters NATO monitors closely hasn't changed. What has changed, based on what's actually been reported, is the intensity of what's being tracked and the UK's willingness to say so publicly instead of keeping the figure inside a classified briefing. Where does this actually stand right now, as of this report? Confirmed: a 25% increase in tracked Russian naval and maritime activity in UK and North Atlantic waters reported by the Royal Navy and covered by USNI News. Also confirmed as long-standing public record, the GI-UK gap as a strategic choke point, the Northern Fleet's base on the Kola Peninsula, the Royal Navy's RFA Proteus and its seabed protection mission, and prior instances of the UK publicly naming and monitoring vessels like the Yantar near its waters. Not confirmed and worth treating with real caution. Any single, agreed explanation of Russian intent behind the reported rise and the precise vessel-by-vessel breakdown of what makes up that 25%. If you want to check any of this yourself rather than take a video's word for it, that's exactly the right instinct and an easy one to follow through on. The original figure comes from USNI News' coverage of the Royal Navy's own reporting. That's the primary place to start: the Royal Navy and the wider UK. Ministry of Defense also published their own press releases on vessel deployments and seabed protection efforts, including on RFA Proteus specifically. Naval news covers this beat in detail and often adds technical context that general news coverage skips. And NATO's Allied Maritime Command puts out its own statements on alliance-wide tracking and response in the North Atlantic, useful for seeing how the UK's reported numbers fit into the broader NATO picture rather than standing alone. So the honest answer to the question this video opened with: a 25% rise is real, it's on the record, and it reflects a genuine intensification of what the Royal Navy is watching in the waters around Britain and across the North Atlantic. What it doesn't do, on its own, is settle the harder question of why. And that's a story that's very likely still being written, one press release and one parliamentary briefing at a time. If this kind of story interests you, how navies actually watch each other and what the seabed infrastructure running under the ocean has to do with it, that's a thread worth pulling on in a future video. RFA Proteus and the broader seabed security mission it represents barely existed as a public conversation a decade ago, and it isn't going away anytime soon.